This happened about 4 years ago. I was 20 at the time. The first time I met the guy who would become my grocery store stalker, he was standing outside the store collecting money for the Salvation Army Christmas time donations. I'm a fairly friendly person, so I like to say hi to people at places I frequent to be nice. This guy was a kid around my age, very tall, a mild resemblance to Lurch from the Addams Family, very dark circles under dark eyes, short black hair, and kind of a vacant look on his face. I chatted with him for all of 2 minutes, just idle chit-chat about the weather and whatnot, nothing particularly memorable or interesting. Then I waved goodbye and went home. Little did I know that this single moment would be the start of something that would have me genuinely afraid. About 4 or 5 months passed by after that interaction, and I hadn't seen him around again. Then one day, as I was grocery shopping with a friend, as we were chatting, she suddenly got real quiet and kind of recoiled backwards, looking behind me. I turned around to see that guy, who had to be at least 6'4", towering over me not 8 inches from my body. He said hi and told me he remembered me from that December I had talked to him, then asked me for my number. I, being young and never having experienced this type of interaction before, told him I didn't have my number memorized, but I would write his down and text him later. I kinda half-waved my phone at him as well, pointing out my at-the-time boyfriend whose picture was my wallpaper, making a point to say, "Oh look, my boyfriend." I hoped this would clue the guy in, but no luck. He told me his number, which immediately upon getting I blocked, without letting him get mine. What made my blood really run cold though, was what he said after I put my phone away. He leaned in real close, and in a very low voice he told me, "Whatever I text you is for your eyes only." At this point, I started to feel genuinely uncomfortable. I said, "Yeah, sure, nice talking to you, but we gotta get back to shopping." I grabbed my friend and dragged her off, shooting a panicked look at her and asking why she didn't bail me out. Apparently, he really scared her too with his getting so close to me, and she didn't know what to do. I want to make it very clear, I'm not exactly a small girl. I'm 5'8" and solidly built. I can handle myself, certainly. I very rarely feel intimidated or small in the presence of anyone, male or female. But this guy was so huge he made me feel tiny and scared. In the months that would follow, he would make me even more truly frightened. I had hoped that creepy interaction would be the last time I saw him, but that was unfortunately not the case. After that initial meeting with him, saying that creepy thing about his texts being for my eyes only, it seemed like I would run into him every single time I went to the store. No matter what checkout lane I was in, he always seemed to appear out of nowhere at the end of it when I finished shopping. Every time I was in the store, I would notice him just out of the corner of my eye, watching me, no matter what area I seemed to be in. One time, I even caught him stealthily following me out to my car. At that point, I got really scared and decided to say something to the managers. After letting them know what was going on, they assured me they would tell him not to talk to me any further. After that, sure, he wouldn't speak to me, but I would continue seeing him follow me around the store at a distance every time I went up there. It got so bad and I felt so frightened, I started to be too scared to go to the store at all. I'm one of those stubborn people, though, who refuses to be intimidated by someone to the point where I'll stop doing something. I had hoped that maybe it was a coincidence that he was following me. After all, it was a big store. Maybe he just had things to do that just happened to be in the areas I was shopping in. I started to pay even closer attention to my surroundings. Once I started really paying attention, though, I realized that every single time I was there, I would constantly notice him in every area of the store I was in. During my last encounter with him, I went to the store to grab just 2 or 3 items I needed for dinner that night. I first saw him standing outside when I got there. With his back to me, I quickly ran inside, hoping he hadn't seen me. Somehow, a few minutes later, I saw him at the very back of the store, and items in hand, I immediately made a beeline towards the front. As soon as I got near the checkout, I ducked behind one of the shelf displays and watched carefully at the front of the store to see if he would appear. Sure enough, he did. I watched as he searched up and down the checkout, and when he didn't see me there, I saw him step outside immediately. At this point, I ran for the nearest open cashier, rang up my items, and stuck my head out the door to look for him. I didn't see him there immediately, so I started trying to make my way back to where I was parked. I had parked a ways away, near the side of the store where a bunch of other small stores and restaurants were lined up. As I was walking towards my car, though, I realized I saw him standing by the entrance I had first entered the store through. I ducked behind a pillar immediately, hoping he hadn't seen me. I watched carefully from behind as he scanned the entire parking lot. Obviously, he couldn't find me. After a minute or two, he started to walk out towards the direction of the lot in front of the store. I took that opportunity to make a quick run for it to my car as soon as he was far enough away that I felt safe. As soon as I reached into my car and locked the doors, to my horror, I looked up and saw him standing right there, only 15 feet away from my car, with a shopping cart in front of him. I knew he had followed me. He knew that I knew he did this. I fully believe he had chased after me, and when I made it to my car, he grabbed the nearest cart to make it look like he was collecting them from the lot. I remember feeling absolutely terrified in that moment. I went home and immediately told my grandfather what happened. I began crying and shaking, and my grandfather told me to get in the car. We were going to settle this. He and I drove up to the store in his car, and he walked me in and demanded we speak to the managers immediately. Both of them. When the managers arrived at customer service, he asked me to tell them what had been happening, and demanded that they ensure he left me alone, or he would involve the police. The managers swore up and down they would take care of it. As far as I know, he wasn't fired immediately though, because my friend who first encountered him with me when this whole thing began told me she would see him from time to time when she was there by herself. Anytime I was there with her though, coincidentally, she would never see him around. I fully believe he knew whenever I was there, only this time instead of stalking me, he started to avoid me altogether. Eventually, everyone who knew the situation stopped seeing him there, so I think he may really have gotten fired or perhaps moved on from that store. Either way, I haven't had any issues since, but I've never felt in my life so afraid of another human being as I did that day. Seeing him make eye contact with me in the parking lot as I locked my car doors. It still gives me creeps to think about. He was watching me so closely every time I entered that he could so easily avoid or follow me however he wanted. When I was 18, I got a job at Walmart. Small town, not much else there for someone fresh out of high school. You know the deal. I had been there about a month or so and worked in the jewelry department, usually from mid-afternoon until the department closed at 9 p.m. I would often close the department by myself, but obviously since Walmart is open 24 hours, other people were almost always around. One night I'm locking the cases up and putting things away. An overnight stalker walks by and says hi. I look up, smile, say hi back, and then go back to my business. This guy, the only way I can describe him is to say he looked kind of like one of the Bee Gees. Shoulder-length, frizzy hair, kind of a bouncy hop to his step whenever he walked, mid-50s. This started to become a regular thing. On nights I closed by myself, he'd walk by, say hi, and I would say hi back. That was about it. No actual conversation ever took place. Then on my birthday, a few of my friends who worked there got me a cake. I hugged them and said thank you. About an hour later, Mr. Bee Gees comes around with a birthday card, gave it to my manager to give to me. The manager thought it was extremely funny that this weirdo got me a card, at least until I opened it. Happy birthday. I saw you hugging those guys earlier. It made me really mad, but I called a friend and talked it out, and he made me realize you're allowed to have other friends than me. Just please don't hug them anymore. Save those hugs for me. I don't know what kind of emotion showed on my face, but my manager grabbed the card, read it, then walked me back to the store manager's office and showed it to him as well. Store manager said the guy was obviously joking, but that he would talk to him about it later. I didn't see Mr. BG's for around a week or so, until one night while I was closing, he plunked down a stuffed envelope on my counter as he walked by without a single word. Inside was 6 pages, front to back, of pure crazy. It was basically his entire life story, all about his family, the schools he went to, but with weird stuff added, like how his sister was a psychic, how his father was an exorcist, all sorts of that weirdness. The end of the letter was about how his friend, who was 18 months old, was missing, and he knew she was being raped because he could hear her screaming his name in his dreams. So, of course, that also went to the store manager. He had me file a written complaint and told me not to go outside by myself, not to wander near where the guy might be while I'm on my breaks. How about you get rid of him instead? 2 nights later, I was finishing up for the night, and the way the counter is set up, there's one opening and the counters go all the way around both sides. He brought a handcart around with boxes for my department, but pushed it into the only opening in the counters. I was now trapped inside. He stood there and stared at me, while I looked at him with what I'm sure was pure terror. I was then, and still am now, riddled with anxiety. I don't like confrontation. The last thing I wanted was for this weirdo to confront me about reporting him, twice. I could hear him whispering something. "Sorry, I didn't mean to scare you." I turned around and started finishing my closing tasks, pretending he wasn't even there, though I could feel his eyes burning into my back. After a few minutes, I just looked at him and said, "Weren't you told to stay away from me?" He gave me the grossest predator grin. The store manager asked me if I was joking, I told him I was. Then he leaned as close to me as he could get with the counter between us and whispered right into my ear, "But I'm not joking." Then he walked away. For 2 weeks after that, he would randomly show up wherever I was. I would leave for lunch, he would be there, even non-work places. I would go to the mall and he would be there too. Another department manager told me he had been reported by 4 other people over the last 2 years for very similar behavior. I again went to my store manager, who told me the guy was harmless and maybe had a little bit of a crush. He was in his 50s, and I was 18 during this crap. A week later, I gave my notice and quit. He still works there 13 years later. Just gives me the heebie-jeebies. This happened around 2 or 3 years ago, but I still think about it every now and then when I'm walking alone and no one else is around. I was volunteering at a school in a rural area about 3 kilometers from my home. I didn't know how to drive, and I have an irrational fear of biking, but that's for another story. I didn't mind walking home every Wednesday because of this. I was 19 at the time, but just know that I looked at least 3 years younger. I was a short girl with a very round face, big eyes, and no makeup. It was winter, and it was very cold. It was also raining, and I had no umbrella either. It's fine though, I liked the rain. I was covered from head to toe, but I still enjoyed my peaceful walk, with music blasting through my headphones. As I was walking though, I saw something in my peripheral vision that I was always scared to see in a situation like this. A car slowing down, following me. I didn't know what to do. I tried not to assume the worst. I turned to see whether that car was the only car on that road, or if there were any potential witnesses in case something did happen. Nope, just this one car following me. No one else around as far as my eyes could see. Just in that moment, the driver lowered his window, and I saw his face. An old man who clearly seemed to take care of himself. Unfortunately, he was very strong looking, his eyes fixed on me. "Where are you headed? Would you like me to take you somewhere?" I took one earphone off, very confused. I had heard him because at that point I had already turned down the music to be more aware of my surroundings. Plus, despite not wanting to assume the worst, I still wanted to buy some time to think of it out in case. Where could I run? Could someone hear me if I screamed? Could anyone else around see us? Where could I go to get help? Well, there was no one, and nowhere to run or hide. I was walking through this very rural area, on the side of this road that had a single field on one side and woods on the other. The only house around was an old abandoned one up ahead. I tried to reason with myself. This man was probably just concerned that I was visibly walking a long distance, right? "Oh, no, thanks. I'm fine. I like walking." "Oh, no. I don't care about that. I just want you to get in my car." What? Maybe he was concerned because it was raining and I didn't have an umbrella or something. No thanks. I know it's raining, but I like the rain, so I'm okay." "No, I don't care. I just want you to get in my car. I'll drive you wherever you need to go." For fuck's sake, really? I'm giving this potential kidnapper 2 excuses and he doesn't take them. His intentions are becoming clearer and clearer. I couldn't ignore this anymore. He never broke eye contact with me, like he was analyzing my every move and reaction. I started to notice as well that his smile was slowly becoming more and more sinister. Was my fear just tricking me? This whole time I was trying to look as friendly and naive as possible because I didn't want him to realize he couldn't trick me into getting into his car. His only choice would be to use force. Remember, no one is around to hear me if I scream. "Listen, I just want to talk to you. Can I?" Well, okay, what is it?" No, I mean, I want to talk to you properly. Get in the car. I just want to talk for a moment." That's the only moment when he broke eye contact. It was to slowly look at me from head to toe. "Well, you know what? How about I park a little bit further and you can join me and have a chat?" Sure. I don't know if you'll find a place to park anywhere close, but go ahead if you want, sir. I'm only walking straight anyway." "Perfect. See you there?" "Yes, sir." He smiled and drove away. I waited for his car to be far enough that I didn't think he could see me anymore. I immediately ran towards the abandoned house to hide, while I made a call to my mom for her to come get me. The police would not do anything, since I'm not in immediate danger. I tried calling my local police once after some serious threats from a stalker, and they told us to only call them if the stalker was on our property. That's also another story, though. I explained everything to my mom. She told me to send her a screenshot of Google Maps with my exact location, just in case something happened, and to stay hidden while keeping an eye on the road to see if the man's car appeared again. I was just about to end the call when I see his car slowly driving by once more. And what do I see when I check to look? He's looking right at me, as if he knew the whole time exactly where I was hiding. He waved at me with a smile on his face, still trying very hard to seem friendly. He knew I was hiding, and on a call with someone right now. He knew I wasn't as naive as I pretended to be. He gave me the creepiest smile, and then he just drove away. My mom was still on the phone with me, so I told her what just happened. She told me to stay calm and wait for her. We end the call. I wait. He doesn't come back again. My mom's car appeared much faster than I anticipated. I got in and we drove home. I still can't wrap my head around exactly what happened, or what could have happened either. Sir, whoever you are, whatever your intentions were, I hope I never see you again. This just occurred this past November. A close friend and I were on fall break from college. and decided to go to an ODESZA concert in downtown Chicago. We grew up in the suburbs, so going to Chicago to have fun was very common for us. Anyways, we had a great time at the concert itself and decided to Uber home since we weren't close to the train station. My friend told me Uber wasn't working for him at the moment, so I called the Uber instead. This was my first time though ever calling one, so I accidentally called an Uber pool, not knowing what that was. My friend saw that I'd done that and thought, doesn't really matter. The driver picks us up from right outside the concert venue. There were a lot of intoxicated people around, as one could imagine post-ODESZA show, but we were pretty sober, as all we did was smoke some weed, which we were quite used to. We hopped in the car and everything was normal so far. We didn't notice though the direction the driver was taking us, as we were wrapped up in talking about the show. Turns up, the driver was going to the south side of Chicago, which we realized after some time by looking at maps. Our suburb, though, was exactly the opposite direction of this lengthy drive south. We decided to attribute this to the fact that it was an Uber pool, and shrugged it off, until we picked up the next passenger. To be honest, this girl scared us. I don't like to judge people at first glance, but she scared us just by how she looked and how she talked. Once she got in, we asked the driver where we were going first, to which he stopped answering. Next thing I knew, my phone lit up, saying that the Uber trip had just been canceled, and for this duration of the ride, Uber had no record of me being in the car. I asked the driver what the hell was going on, and he didn't answer. It soon became clear the girl and the driver 100% knew each other, as they started calling each other nicknames. The girl was being quite strange, and seemed to be giving some sort of hand signals to him. We proceeded to drive even further south, to this neighborhood which was the sketchiest one I'd ever seen. I mean, it was so bad that I didn't even know neighborhoods like this even existed. Every single house was completely wrecked. There were no street signs on any of the streets. Most of the streetlights were bursted out or flickering, and homeless people were lying everywhere. There were beat-down warehouses and dark alleys too. This was by far the scariest area I'd ever seen. No one who cared would hear a scream in this area. Once we started seeing all of this, our hearts dropped because the driver refused to respond to anything we said. My friend looked over to me and whispered, "We need to get the fuck out of here." I replied, "Dude, look where we are." So we stayed in the car together. We got driven down this alley behind a warehouse where the streets ended. There were only fields beyond it. The driver was going down this alleyway at 2 miles per hour, but kept on slowly driving. The girl and the driver were clearly discussing something serious, but we couldn't make it out since they were mostly using hand signals. At the time, our hearts sank even more. We literally both thought we were going to be killed in this alley, or at best someone was going to get in the car and rob us. He stopped, the doors unlocked, and I was in complete shock with a pale face. All of a sudden my friend says, "Hey, you know I'm completely sober. I'm about to call 911. I'm assuming the driver had been waiting around the concert to pick up some wasted people to allow this to happen, but we were both sober. My friend was very serious. He already had 911 dialed up on his phone. The Uber driver looked back at us in complete shock as he saw the number dialed, and my friend's finger about to push the call. He looked over at the girl. The girl was clearly in shock as well. She shook her head no. "What the fuck, Rye?" The driver's nickname. She hopped out of the car. The driver then drove out of the neighborhood and onto the highway towards our suburb. All of a sudden, my Uber app gave me a notification saying we were now in a ride. All of a sudden, the driver was driving us to our actual destination. But again, he wasn't giving us any answers. He just said he was taking us home. We were wondering what the fuck just happened. He wouldn't say a single word to us. He would give brief responses about where we were going, but not a single thing about what happened. We got home safely and reported that driver for this ride, because obviously this was not how it was supposed to go. We think that the driver had been trying to wait for wasted people to call a pool so he could get away with this, but realized we were too big of a risk when it came time to do what they were going to do. We accepted we were part of a mugging scheme and got lucky we decided to not get drunk at that concert. We had anxiety for weeks after this, but at least now we know just how sketchy some areas can be and how to be more safe in Chicago by not calling an Uber pool outside of a concert or bar or anywhere you'll be intoxicated. It's so weird to me that people live like this, doing these kinds of sketchy things to innocent people, but I guess in a way it was very eye-opening. I'm a 33-year-old white female from Los Angeles. 3 years ago, my boyfriend and I, as planned for 5 years, turned 30, sold everything we owned, including my car, took his Trailblazer, and decided to just travel around the States and Canada. I guess you could sort of call us backpackers, as we tended to chase good weather, find a state park, and backcountry hike into the wilderness for days at a time. My brother liked to joke that we're anti-establishment hippies. We don't necessarily live off the grid, but between the two of us, we have one single prepaid phone, which we use for emergencies or checking in with family and friends, and a single MacBook which I use for work. I'm a freelance writer and content creator, and I'm on retainer with a robotics company. I mostly write boring white papers or web content, things like that. The whole point of our living situation is to live debt-free and have as few bills as possible. I only ever use free Wi-Fi, so 1 to 2 times a week we have to go to a city with a Starbucks. This background info is important so you know more about who we are and how simply we try to live. Neither one of us is involved in social media, and we know very little about Reddit or Instagram or whatever apps are around these days. Our phone isn't even a smartphone. We don't even text. Last summer, we decided to do some backcountry hiking in Arkansas. It's one of those states you don't ever really hear about other hikers visiting, but we read that it had some really beautiful natural landscapes. By the way, it sure does. The rules at this particular park were very lax. We didn't need a permit, there were very few basic laws or guidelines, and there was no check-in needed either. We had all the basics with us and planned to do a 6-day hike, 3 days in, 3 days out. The whole time we were out, we didn't see or hear another soul. But on day 1, we were prepping to move off trail and find a camping spot, as it was getting near dusk. A half a mile off trail is usually the standard for us. We took what looked like kind of an animal trail, and about a half mile out we saw a green 2-person tent. It was almost kind of camouflaged in the foliage, so we came upon it almost by accident. Some backpackers prefer their privacy. Others are a bit more social. We are the more social type. We've had some great experiences camping near other backpackers, sharing stories, sharing food, even sharing a joint or two. We were about 30 yards away from the tent, which was zipped closed at this point. My boyfriend shouted out a greeting to make our presence known. No movement and no sound. We assumed green tent guy either wasn't around or didn't want to be bothered, so we started off in a new direction to put some distance between us. We camped and never heard a single peep. We moved along the next morning, completely forgetting all about green tent guy, until nearing the end of day 5 on our trek back. We were again looking for a spot to camp off trail when we saw that green tent was still there. It wasn't necessarily that unusual, but normally backcountry hikers like to keep moving, so we weren't expecting it to still be there. This time, the tent flap was open though. My boyfriend yelled out his greeting again, but there was still no response. He wanted to go check it out, saying it was really weird and maybe the person had been hurt or something. I didn't really like that idea from the get-go, because even though we hadn't had any bad experiences personally, we'd heard far more than enough stories from other backpackers about hermits, mountain men that want privacy, people who carry guns all the time. but my boyfriend assured me we'd be fine. If all else failed, all we had to do was offer him some weed to keep the peace and go on our way. As soon as we got within 20 yards, the smell of decomposition was intense. My boyfriend had been hailing his greeting over the last 20 yards, but once the smell hit him, he stopped and turned to me concerned. What if we find a dead body? My skin crawled. I was immediately afraid. I had never seen a dead body before, and I didn't want to now. The closer we got to the tent, the worse the smell got. I knew for sure we were going to walk in and see some old camper's rotting corpse. What we found, though, was worse than that. Outside the tent was a dead doe's legs, all 4 of them coated with flies. It looked like the legs had been cut most of the way and ripped off the rest. It was a complete mess. Inside was the body and head of the deer. The middle portion was swaddled in a blue fleece blanket that was soaked with blood at the bottom, where the legs used to be. It was laying on its side, bottom facing the tent entry. The tail had been sliced off, and the anus and vagina was covered in dried blood and a gape, like something had been penetrating it. The same with its mouth. The bottom portion was bent down at a scary broken-looking angle. The tent was open now, so we could see everything without having to go inside. Not that we could have anyway, because the smell at that point was nearly debilitating. There was a dirty, almost empty clear bottle of Jergens baby oil and a stained green and white fringed kitchen towel. That was it. I immediately started crying and begged him to leave. All he could muster was a, "What the fuck?" We turned around and ran. We ran to the trail and jogged down it as far as we could go until dusk was finally on us, and we had to set up camp. We didn't go very far off of it, and neither of us could sleep that night. We didn't start a fire or use headlamps after full dark. We just sat up whispering to one another, going over and over what we had just seen. Every single little noise startled us. It was like our brains were on red alert. I kept thinking that at any moment a dead deer rapist would come back to his tent and see our footprints or something. Then he'd know where we were and track us back to where we were. I had never been so scared in my entire life. Just before dawn, we tore down and started out. My boyfriend stopped at the ranger station on our way out of the park to report what he had seen. The ranger was a young guy around our age, and he looked as freaked out by our story as we were telling it. He wrote most of it down, and my boyfriend showed him on a map approximately where it had been. He asked if we knew how the deer was killed, and at that point we hadn't even thought about it. We assumed it had been shot, but because of the blanket we didn't see a wound. We weren't exactly giving it an autopsy either. We've since shortened our backcountry hikes to a maximum of 4 days. We've also been a lot less eager to call out to other campsites, and have never approached another unmanned tent again. So this happened to me on Thursday, April 25th, and I still can't shake off how terrifying and strange it was. I was home alone getting ready for my 12 o'clock college class that morning. I opened my blinds to let some natural light in. When I glanced out my window, I saw a man in his mid-30s, wearing a baseball cap and roaming around my property. He had his hands on his hips, swaggering around with a lot of weird confidence. Our yard was kind of like a cliff, and looked over onto our 5 acres of property down below. I live in the Pacific Northwest, so it's a pretty scenic view. I was really confused. Maybe this was a worker my mom had hired for our renovations on the house or something, just admiring the view. I was a bit uncomfortable at this point, because the dude walked to the side of my house and out of my line of sight. I headed upstairs to see him now roaming around my front yard and driveway, looking at things, checking out my house. It seemed he still hadn't seen me at this point, though. I called my dad and asked him if we had hired anyone to come by the house. He said not that he knew of, and told me he was going to call my mom and ask her as well. then call me back right away. I was waiting for my dad's call when I took notice of this strange dude's car. It was a white Honda with no license plates, just parallel parked to my front door. The dude obviously still hadn't seen me and was wandering around. I took this as an opportunity to remember the security system, and I armed it, so if he did try to break in, it would immediately alert the police. If this was some sort of professional or worker anyway, he would have rang my doorbell by now, or at least knocked once. He did neither though. Just then, I got a call back from my dad, saying neither him nor my mom hired anyone to come by today. I needed to call our police station immediately. I went back downstairs after making sure to lock every door and window upstairs. I called my city's police station. I explained to a woman on the other end what was happening. She decided she was not going to send an officer out. Instead, she gave me a number to call their emergency dispatch line and told me to talk to them. I called the number she gave me. Immediately, I get an automated message. "Thank you for calling my town's name, non-emergency hotline. Nobody is available to take your call right now. If this is an emergency, please hang up and dial 911. At this point, I was really irritated because 15 minutes had passed in this wasted time, and this weird dude was now lurking around my house. Apparently, being home alone with a strange man skulking around wasn't enough to warrant an emergency to that lady. I hung up and decided to call 911. After getting in touch with the operator there, I was asked a series of questions about his appearance before they would even alert officers near me to start heading toward my house. This whole thing just seemed really weird. It seemed like nobody was in a hurry to have officers come up to my place when I was a younger girl home alone with this guy. I asked the officer if I could stay on the line with her when she finally, after what seemed like forever, alerted the police to come. She agreed to stay on the line, and I went back upstairs to check on where this weird guy was. He was now sitting in his unplated Honda, either listening to a radio show extremely loudly or on a phone call with someone through his car. There was a very prominent loud male voice coming from it. All of a sudden, I heard the tone you hear when someone hangs up on you, and the operator was no longer on the line. I was really confused when my thoughts were interrupted by an unrecognized phone number calling me. I assumed it was the operator calling me back, so I picked it up right away. Instead, I was greeted by this creepy heavy breathing. I'm not sure who it was exactly, but it really freaked me out. I hung up immediately and dialed back 911. I had been pretty calm up to this point, all things considered, but that phone call put me into full-on panic mode. I got on the phone with another operator who already knew my situation and address before I could even explain. She said cops were already on their way. 20 minutes had passed at this point. The dude was still there in his car, and the cops hadn't arrived yet. Keep in mind, I live in a smaller-sized town, so there's no reason why it took them so long as they did to come down. Finally, this dude was leaving my driveway right as the cops pulled in. They stopped him and asked a few questions. A cop came to my door and handed me an extremely unbelievably sketchy-looking flyer. "Oh, it was just a landscaper. He said you made an appointment." I was really relieved, but also irritated that it was just a dude my mom had hired. That was until I remembered that it was not. I called my mom back and said the cops said it was just a landscaper, that he had an appointment as well. She reassured me. "I can assure you we never hired a landscaper. We don't even need one." After that, nothing else happened in the end. Never really got closure on the whole event, and it really creeps me out to this day. So let me start by saying this is the first time I'm sharing this, and I kinda hope I'll never have to talk about it again. I've been struggling with this for a few years now, and I still have a hard time sharing it. First, some backstory, so you can understand the history I had with this guy, and why this all messed me up so badly. Almost 12 years ago, I met a guy named Charlie online in a video game. We played together for a long while and talked every day. Eventually, we exchanged phone numbers and started texting one another. We called a bunch, and this inevitably led to developing feelings for one another. I decided that I was an adultish woman at the ripe age of 19, almost 20. Surely it would be fine to make the 3,000-mile move to be with this guy. At this point, we had been talking for almost 2 years, and I felt very confident in this choice. He promised me everything a girl could ever want in a relationship, and I fell for it hook, line, and sinker. I arrived in a southern Texas town, and he picked me up from the airport. We drove to his house. The plan was that I would live in his grandmother's house, being as it was vacant, and I could afford the rent. He said since his grandmother had recently passed away, it was something he had already cleared with his aunt, and it was all good to move in. He originally told me he would move in with me too, which never actually ended up happening. The first red flag should have been when he hid me in the house. He had never actually gotten the permission for me to live there, and as it turned out, that house was going to be sold in just a few weeks. This meant I ended up on the couch at his parents' house, who he lived with. His family was really religious, and he didn't want to let them down by finding somewhere else for us. So I lived with them for a few months, paying rent by cooking and cleaning for his family. I got a part-time job as well, working with Charlie at a major clothing retailer. I go to his church to fit in with his group of friends, and everything is going great so far. His family seemed to really like me, and I was enjoying my time in Texas. The second red flag I missed, though, was his hesitation to ever introduce me as his girlfriend. He would simply introduce me as his friend, and tell people we were just friends as well. In private, though, it was the exact opposite. He would constantly tell me how much he loved me, how much he cared for me, how he couldn't wait for us to be together forever. Everyone knew Charlie and I were together, but he denied it hard. After about 6 months of this, I was approached by some girl, whose name I can't even remember. She basically told me I'd stolen her man, and that one day some other girl was going to weasel her way in like I did, and I'd know her pain. Then she just left. I never saw her again or anything. Fast forward about 2 or 3 years. I finally began to catch on about his shit. I was tired of being told in public I was not his girlfriend. We were on and off again at this point, but we still had some feelings for each other and decided to give it another go. A new girl named Lucy started to work with us, and they became fast friends, her calling at all hours to complain about her jerk boyfriend. Instantly, I had a bad feeling about her. I really hated her, but I tried so hard to like her and be friends, inviting her over for drinks, taking her to concerts, you name it. I really tried against my better judgment. Turns out her birthday came up and he took her to lunch while I was working. I saw this picture he posted of her on Facebook, and the look she was giving him in the picture, I just knew he was screwing her. My heart sank. So I confronted him. He told me it was an unfair question to ask if he was sleeping with her. So I broke up with him, but decided to stay friends. The biggest mistake of my life. Lucy started talking about Charlie and his skills in bed, bad-mouthing him, spreading rumors at work and around town, just all sorts of crazy drama. And of course, she blamed me. Around that time, Charlie was also passed over for promotion at his work. He made an offhanded comment about how he was going to shoot up the store because of this. Charlie was of course let go, and rumors really started to run wild. I stayed silent because of an investigation at work about them, and with that comment Charlie had made about shooting everyone up, I wanted no part in that mess. About a week, maybe 2 later, Charlie asked me to go to the movies with him. I said I would go. Then he kidnapped me, taking me way into the back country, far, far away from anywhere. We were in the middle of nowhere when he parked the car. I felt super scared at this point. He hadn't said a single word in over 30 minutes, and I didn't have cell service this far out. At that point, he pulled out a gun, cocked it and pointed it at me, and demanded I tell the truth or he would kill me right then and there. I started crying, telling him I had no idea what he was on about. He pulled the trigger. It was empty. He cocked it again and pointed it once more, again telling me I needed to tell the truth, that we were playing Russian roulette and I would die if I kept lying. He did this 3 more times. Each time was empty. I was in hysterics at this point. I couldn't breathe, I was crying so hard. Then he just tossed the gun in the back seat with a laugh. "I'm just playing with you. I wanted to see if you'd keep your story straight. I had to be sure who was lying to me. I'm so glad it's not you. You're such a great friend." He drove us back to town for the movies, talking the whole time like nothing had ever happened. I was still terrified. I knew I had to get away, so I excused myself partway into the movie. I went into the restroom, called a friend to pick me up, and then I called the cops. When it was all said and done, they couldn't do anything to him because he'd never actually hurt me, and he didn't have the gun when they came to his house. I had no direct proof anything had actually happened. I went into hiding, and later found out he had planned this out with Lucy. This was going to be her way to get rid of me, because she was jealous. He went on to date her for a few more years. I've been hiding from him for 5 years now, and eventually cut all contact with mutual friends when one of them was having lunch with me and told Charlie about it. Thankfully, I left before he was able to show up. He apparently really wanted to talk to me, but I really hope we never meet again. This all started about a year ago. I, 23 and female, live on the 2nd floor of an apartment complex and have lived here my entire life. The building is mostly comprised of families with young children and married couples as well. A lot of the families have lived here as long as my family has, so everyone knows each other pretty well. There's only one apartment unit that isn't occupied by a family, but rather by a pair of brothers who tended to keep to themselves. One day, one of their sons around my age appeared out of the blue. He was very strange right off the bat. He would always wear a sweatshirt with his hood up and would run through the apartment complex to get to his. I'm not sure what his face even looked like because he always had his hood completely covering it. He lived on the 1st floor, on the back side of the complex. He would often get into his place by jumping through the window. He basically did everything in his power to avoid detection. I didn't mind him though because I never saw him due to my busy schedule. One day though, he just suddenly started sitting on the top staircase that leads to my apartment. This was strange because his unit was on the other side and on the 1st floor as well. I brushed it off at first, but then it began to happen every single day. Whenever I would come home from school, he would be there. When my boyfriend at the time would drop me off at night, typically around 10:30 or 11, he would be there. Sometimes when I would leave and come back hours later, he would still be in the exact same spot, as if he hadn't moved all through the 5+ hours I was gone. At this point, I told my parents and my boyfriend about it, and they all became very vigilant. My boyfriend would park his car and walk me to my door every night he dropped me off. Once the guy saw my boyfriend, he stopped sitting on the staircase. I thought it would finally be over, but of course it wasn't. Instead, he started waiting for me at my bus stop. The bus I take home from school stops right across the street from my home, so it's only a short walk away. One day when I was getting off, I saw him waiting there for me. Once he saw me get off, he followed me into the complex and sat on the staircase same as ever. He also started to follow me whenever I would walk my dog. At this point, my parents were really upset. My mom started letting the neighbors know he was following me around. My neighbors started making sure he wasn't bothering me, or if I was alone, they would start a conversation with me until I got to my door. One day, I got a random friend request on Facebook from this guy. Mind you, he had never spoken a single word to me, so I didn't know how he even knew my name, let alone found me on Facebook. My mom tried talking to his father, but they would never answer the door whenever she knocked. So I'm thinking this can't possibly get any worse, right? Even though he was following me around, he seemed pretty harmless so far, so I wasn't too scared yet. I was wrong. One day when I returned from my boyfriend's house, my mom told me she had something to tell me, but she didn't want me to get spooked. She proceeded to tell me that when she was walking toward the kitchen to get a glass of water, she'd seen something in the tree move. Our kitchen has a huge window that takes up most of the wall. In front of this window, there's a huge tree. If someone were to climb this tree per se, you could see into our apartment completely. Well, guess what? When my mom began to take a closer look, she realized my neighbor was sitting in the tree, looking straight into the apartment. My mom called my dad over, and when that neighbor saw my dad, he jumped right off of it. At that moment, I felt my peace stolen from me. We filed a police report, but when the police went looking for him, he was gone. It turned out there were snack wrappers and a blanket hidden in between the leaves of the tree. The police think it wasn't the first time he was up on there. I couldn't help but wonder how many times he'd seen me walking around, and I had no idea. It's been about 6 months, and I haven't seen him since then. His father still lives in the complex, but there's been no sight of him. The police haven't been able to find him either, so I really have no idea what happened to him. All I can hope is that I never encounter him again. I've been doing my 1 hour of outdoor exercise at night because I find it the most relaxing at that time. My neighborhood is very quiet, and I'm lucky to live in a nice area which I've always considered super safe. I used to walk at night even before lockdown. Because I live right next to a canal, so there are lots of nice paths that are super pretty at night when everything is all lit up by the moon. Anyway, I was walking last night and decided to go to the shop first because I was hungry. Then I detoured back to my usual route along the canal. When I was walking, I heard these 2 guys speaking super loudly in German. I live in England, so it was a bit unusual but not anything to think twice about. They looked around 30 years old, pretty tall, and they had caps on as well. I remember this because they had matching designs, which I thought was kind of funny. They started getting really close. When I glanced back to look at them, they started jeering, so I knew they were looking at me. This kind of freaked me out, so I sped walked toward the shop but had to stop at the road. I wasn't planning on getting hit by a car just because I was startled. They caught up with me in this time, but didn't stop for the lights to change. They just walked across the street and went into the store I was headed for. I shrugged off my hunger and decided to just go to the canal for my walk instead. I stopped thinking about those men soon after, chalking it up to just being a person with general anxiety. I don't particularly like walking past strangers at night anyway, and I'm self-conscious enough as it is without them talking to or about me. Anyway, I complete my walk and start heading back home. For the story to make sense, I need to describe where I was standing. On my right, there was the water itself. I was stood on the path, and to my left there was a big drop that went straight onto the main road. Next to that road, there was a row of houses. There was a railway bridge in front of me. I had my headphones in, and my music was blasting pretty loud. I thought I could make out someone shouting at me though, so I took out one earphone and tried to listen. It was pretty silent apart from the passing cars on the road below me. That's when I saw 2 men heading toward the bridge though. I immediately recognized them as the 2 guys who had jeered at me before from their caps. I stopped walking as my anxiety flooded back through me. I considered phoning somebody because I irrationally thought if I was on the phone, they would just walk past me and not bother me. Despite the fact that I'd stood frozen for ages though, nobody had come out from under the bridge yet. I waited, staring at the bridge for a while in complete confusion. I mean, there's no way they could have just vanished, right? I could see through to the other side, so I knew they didn't just turn around and walk away or anything. Certainly, though, they hadn't walked all the way through, because no one had passed me yet. After a few moments, I began to think I'd just hallucinated them all together or something. I have no history of hallucinations, but I really couldn't find another way to explain it. I started to slowly walk toward the mouth of the bridge, but just as I was about to step in, I see it. The shadow of one of the men being cast across the wall. My blood literally ran cold as I realized just what was going on. The men were waiting for me at the other side of the bridge. They had hidden behind the abutment so I wouldn't see them. My mind went to a million different places, panicking about what they would do if I walked under that bridge. I was convinced they'd follow me at least. If I stayed where I was and phoned for help, I was certain they'd come out to see what was going on, and I'd be trapped. I did the only thing I could think to do. I quietly ran to the fence that separated the canal path from the drop to the main road, and climbed it. It was only about thigh height, and on the other side there was a small space before the wall and drop itself. I waited for a couple of moments as the cars passed by. Thankfully, I live in a quiet area, so soon enough the road was empty. I managed to navigate myself so I could lower myself off the drop without A, having to make too much noise, or B, hurting myself too much. The moment my feet hit the road, I raced to the side where the houses were, and walked down that path as fast as I could without making noise. I only glanced back when I was nearing the end of the road. The men were still there next to the bridge. I could see they were glancing around, looking through to see where I had gotten to. I felt sick and terrified, but thankfully I made it home safe and sound. I don't know what they wanted. I don't know who they were or if they'll be there again tonight. But what I do know is I'm not going to be walking at night for a very long time. So about 3 years ago, I was going to school in a US city and was living with 2 other roommates. My one roommate was known to usually bring seedy characters back to the apartment. At one point during our fall semester, she befriended a guy in her advertising class who went by the name of Dallas. He became her weed dealer, and she would very frequently bring him over to the apartment. My other roommate and I thought he was charismatic enough, but also didn't see the appeal that Christy, my roommate who had befriended him, saw. I remember one night we had Dallas over for dinner. He told us how he played for our college's football team, that he had just started his own business at the age of 25. He was a very well-known weed dealer who made a shit ton of money. His name was Dallas because he used to live in Dallas, Texas, and his parents apparently named him after that. Me and my other roommate nodded our heads and listened along, but we didn't think much of it except for that this dude really thought he was the hottest shit and wanted to gloat all about himself. Mind you, he was like 5'4" and probably not much over 150 pounds. I believe he came over for dinner or something maybe 1 or 2 other times. My roommate claimed that one time she decided to buy weed from him and went to his apartment off campus. When she arrived, she saw our roommate Christy pass the fuck out on a chair in the middle of the day in Dallas's apartment in some random room. When my roommate had arrived, he had mentioned nothing about her being there. My roommate shook her awake. Christy woke up in a haze and basically told my roommate to fuck off. She recounted the story to me, and we both agreed it was really weird. Dallas was probably not the safest person to hang around with. After a couple of months, Christy stopped hanging around with him too. I remember her saying he'd gotten very angry when she didn't want to sleep with him. I also found out that a friend of hers, who knew him for a long time, was apparently engaged to him. Oh, and also his real name wasn't actually Dallas. What a shocker. Fast forward 2 years. Neither me nor my roommate talked to Christy anymore. We were living somewhere else in the city at that time, doing our own thing. We get an alert on our phones. A girl who had just transferred to our college went missing after leaving one of the campus bars the previous night. It didn't take very long, maybe only a few days, when this huge story broke. This girl was killed by someone she left the bar with that night. My roommate called me up. "Dude, do you remember what Dallas's real name was?" Yeah, I believe it was," and said his real name. "Go online and read this article. He just fucking killed that girl who went missing." Sure enough, I go online, and there is the most horrifying mugshot of Dallas, right next to a photo of the girl he had slain. It gets even crazier. Apparently, he had taken her home that night, an attempt at a one-night stand sort of deal, I assume. I guess at some point things turned bad, and he killed her with blunt force and strangulation. If that isn't terrible enough, he cleaned up the evidence in his apartment, threw her body into a storage container, and took a motherfucking lift to his grandma's house, hours away. He buried the storage container with her remains inside on his grandma's property. After obtaining a video of the two of them leaving the bar together, it didn't take cops long to bust his murdering ass. Weeks after the story broke, so many girls came forward and shared similar creepy stories about Dallas. The guy who said he played for the college football team and ran a successful business. As you can guess, none of that was ever true. Also, he was like 28 years old, claiming he was still a student at our college, trying to pry on younger women. It's a horrible story about what happened to that girl. I hope Dallas rots in jail for the rest of his life. I've always wanted to share something of my own, because I've always been listening and reading posts like this since I was very little. I can't say that I'm too pleased to have an experience of my own to post now that it's actually happened to me, though. I really haven't told anybody this story, because I didn't want to freak out any of my friends. I've limited it to just my mom and a few very close friends, and I guess now you'll know too. So, let's begin. How my friend group works is we have our little circle of people who we hang around with most often, but for big events like bonfires or something similar, we expand and let a couple of different friend groups join. Ben is a part of one of these extended friend groups. He's someone who always posts different and interesting things. He always seems like he's got something to say, you know? I've gotten along with Ben really well at these events, and we always ended up chatting together. I've always found him to be a different and somewhat unique individual. Ben started going to my local college this year. He shot me a Snapchat at one point basically saying, "Hey there, all my friends went away to different schools and the only person I have to talk to from the area is my now ex-girlfriend. I was wondering if maybe you wanted to get a group together and hang out or something? I'd like to have some friends around." It was actually a really nice message. With the types of courses I was in, I didn't really get to make very many friends at college, and all my close friends were now spread out too a bit. So I said yes. The hangout was initially supposed to be one of my friends, him, and one of his friends. It was a day after class and I'd just gotten home. He told me he was going to take a quick nap before we all head out. When he woke up though, he told me it was now too late, and he had other plans he'd forgotten about. That was totally fine. I mean, stuff happens, right? I wasn't too upset about it. I canceled with my friend too, so I could just sit down and do some homework. He texted me a few hours later though. I had never given him my number, by the way, so I don't know how he actually found it, telling me his other plans just got canceled, and now he was available again, and wondering if I wanted to do something that night. My friend had now driven out of the city. He texted his friend but said they didn't answer. He decided to pick me up and go for a drive and just chat. It seemed like normal enough friend stuff. Ben arrived at my house once again at around 10 o'clock. I go and hop in his car and he speeds off. Oddly enough though, he was talking in a very accented voice now, kind of Jamaican or something similar. I thought he was just being goofy at first, so I played along as well. Sometimes I would answer back in the same accent, but then I started to think how weird it was that he was not talking in his own voice at all. He was driving around like a maniac now down the street, telling me he had been drinking earlier because he thought he was going to a party. I asked him if he was drinking and driving right now, and he said that he'd only had a few sips. I know I probably should have found a way to get out of the car right then and there, but at this point we were flying down the highway, and I was starting to get scared. He began to rant about his ex, telling me there was infidelity and trust issues on his end, and he couldn't tell me what they were because he didn't want me to think badly of him or something. He told me he was still going to marry this girl and have her children. He ranted about her and started to go on tangents and scream and yell. I started to suspect he must have been on some sort of drug. We arrived at my college, a half-hour to 45-minute drive away in another city. He told me to get out of the car. I was scared, my phone was dying, and I just had to listen to what he said. At this point, I was wondering if he might actually kill me or something. He dragged me through the light woods, and then started to make sounds like a creature. He would make like these weird dinosaur sounds, or like those weird sounds you'd hear the Grudge make. He would also walk like a creature as well, doing all these weird creepy body movements. At this point, I wanted to just go home because I was literally terrified. We went back to the car and started to drive back. He pulled out a pipe and started smoking something while driving. I told him he probably shouldn't do that, but he refused to listen. Instead, he began to yell and shout at me, then start back on his tangents about life again. He pulled over the car to get out and do some jumping kicks in the middle of nowhere. It was so bizarre. At this point, my phone had just died as well. He hopped back in the car and put on his favorite song. He began to scream out the lyrics and smash the windows, dashboard, and wheel with his hands, stomping his feet on the pedals the whole time. I've seen someone passionate about a song before, but I'd never seen anything like this. He began to swerve all around the road in and out until we finally arrived at my house. He then turned to me like nothing was wrong and without an accent said, "I know it's late, but did you perhaps want to have sex?" In the most casual tone in the world as well. I gave a nervous laugh and said, actually, I'm good." He turned to the back seat to get something. I hopped out of the car and booked it to my house. I locked the door to my house and the bedroom door in my room, as if I was terrified he would break in or something. It might not sound as terrifying as it was for me in the moment, but at the time I was shaking out of fear. I don't know if he was just on some crazy drug or if he had a split personality or whatever, but I've never met a person before who I just looked at and immediately thought to myself, you are going to kill someone someday. I really hope he doesn't see this, because I actually still see him at school frequently. So, yeah, what a fun life. I met John at a party when I was 21 years old. He was handsome and a very smooth talker. Honestly, I hated him the first time we talked. He stole my hat and refused to give it back until I gave him my number. Instead of listening to my gut, though, I gave in. We ended up texting back and forth, and eventually decided to go on a date. It turned out John lived just around the corner from me. Right off the bat, he told me about his mental health issues. Bipolar, OCD, depression, and anxiety. He reassured me, though, that he was taking medication for all of them. I was studying psychology in college and thought my knowledge of mental health could be very beneficial to our relationship. I opened up to him about my own traumas and hardships, which bonded us close together. After a couple of months, though, I started to notice something was off. He would have these grandiose ideas about our relationship and his future for about a week or two. Then, after some time, he would just stop going into work. He'd lie about it all day, until he would finally blow up on me, telling me he was so anxious to go he spent the whole morning throwing up. I really did try my best to be supportive of him. I told him there were other jobs he could try out, but he would always bring it back to how little I knew about hard work. I quickly noticed that his highs and lows were like clockwork. He'd cycle through about every 6 to 8 weeks. I knew it must be his bipolar disorder. but he'd assured me he was taking his medication. Throughout the relationship, he became extremely possessive. If a man looked at me while we were walking down the street, he would immediately accuse me of knowing him and would not talk to me for the rest of the day. He'd constantly accuse me of cheating on him with every person who even looked at me. I felt like I couldn't even talk to men or dress nicely because I was afraid of attracting any attention. We broke up several times throughout a 9-month period. He'd say he couldn't be with me. Then 2 weeks later, he'd have a list of all the things he planned on doing if I decided to take him back. He'd tell me all the ways he would work to improve himself and our relationship, and I trusted him. I could only take so much of the ups and downs, and when I found out he wasn't actually taking his medication or seeing a therapist like he promised, I told him I could not do this anymore. Of course, he was furious. He texted me these long, abusive rants about how worthless I was, how no one would ever be with me or connect with me. I was too privileged to ever make a difference in life. I was terrified by his sudden switch. After 3 weeks, I ended all communication. I blocked his number and social media, and then he began to stalk and harass me. Living so close by was suddenly only convenient for him and my own personal hell. I remember one particular night around 3 a.m. I began to hear pounding on my window. I was terrified. I couldn't even move. The pounding grew louder and more intense as I slowly slipped out of my bed onto the floor. He then started gently calling my name, like a horror movie. After about 15 minutes of fear, it was quiet. I called my mom and then the police. The police found a piece of paper taped to my door in red scribbled lettering. It said he knew we belonged together, and he'd make sure we ended up together no matter what he had to do. I was shocked. The police told me that since the relationship was so on and off that this was all my fault. I needed to be more clear about what I wanted clearly. Throughout the next couple of months, he'd show up outside of my bedroom window and watch me. I continued to call the police, who told me I didn't need to file a report and that just calling was good enough. He also began using friends' social medias to harass me, begging me to give him another chance. He even emailed my school email to attempt to get me to talk to him. I eventually contacted the school, who personally delivered a letter to him banning him from the campus. This only made him even more furious. He began texting me from a friend's phone, telling me that unless I responded, he would come to campus whenever he wanted just to intimidate me. That was the final straw. I went to the police and filed a report. Eventually, he did find a new girlfriend, and the stalking stopped. However, just last week, I was taking the train when I noticed him staring at me from the corner of a train car. His eyes were so dark and empty. I truly hope I never see him or hear from him ever again. This happened nearly a decade ago, when I was your quintessential angsty weird little teenager, quite moody and angry at the world. Ironically, I think that's what ultimately saved me, but the guilt still will never leave. I've never fully shared this with anyone before. My family lived in one of the nicer neighborhoods of my city, and unfortunately, muggings weren't uncommon. Though to my knowledge at the time, none had ever resulted in anyone's death. I wasn't really following the neighborhood news at the time, or any news really. I could tell my mother was getting increasingly worried though, over the past few months. I just didn't care enough to ask why. She was constantly reminding me to lock all the doors, travel in groups, not talk to strangers, yada yada yada. The same spiel most responsible parents give their kids. Only, I took insult to being lectured like this weekly about safety at 16. Our first fight about this happened when I was told I was not allowed to walk home from the train alone anymore. At the time, I was taking some extracurricular lessons at the center of the city and rode the train to the end of the line where we lived, which was in no way remote. Our apartment building was only a 10-minute walk from the station, and I had been doing that distance since I was little. I could literally do it with my eyes closed. I usually walked around with my headphones on and my old, much-beloved CD player in my bag, listening to something loud and grungy probably, feeling completely safe in my little bubble of melodious solitude. Cue lots of yelling and screaming. Lots of, "You still treat me like a child, you don't trust me, you're suffocating me and taking away my freedom, you're the world's worst mother ever." You get the idea. Eventually, we came to a compromise. As long as there was still light out, I could walk home. Otherwise, I had to give her a call and she'd come pick me up. I was fine with that, for the time. On that particular night, however, I was really angry. Don't ask me what about, I honestly couldn't tell you the reason. I just remember the wrath. I wanted to scream bloody murder, and the feeling got even more exacerbated, of course, when I realized I had to call my mommy to come pick me up. Nope. No way was I going to do that. It didn't matter that it was raining. I wasn't a baby or made out of sugar or something. I got off the train and ignored the heavy rain and marched straight home. On the outside, I must have looked like a normal 16-year-old though, listening to some music while hurrying home. On the inside, I was preparing to crush my enemies, see them kneeling before me, and hear the lamentation of their women. The way from the station to my home is pretty well lit, except for one single turn. Back then, there were unkempt hedges on both sides of the corner, one in front of an abandoned lot, and no streetlights at all for about 100 feet. I approached this turn, completely oblivious to my surroundings, internally planning my revenge against a yet unidentified foe, when someone jumped out of the bushes beside me, wielding a large knife. Most of what follows I remember in a blur. I don't remember what he looked like. It was dark and he was wearing a hood. I remember him smelling quite strongly of medicinal alcohol, but I honestly don't recall him saying a single word. He probably didn't have enough time to anyway, because when he jumped out of the shadows, I was so startled I dropped my Discman. And that was it. I saw red and completely lost it on this guy. All of the day's frustration poured out of me like a dam breaking, and I unleashed a torrent of swear words at him, most of which I made up on the spot. I completely ignored the knife and shoved him back hard, screaming, "Are you fucking kidding me? Are you fucking kidding me right now?" Over and over. I bent over to pick up my shattered CD player. I don't know what he did. I don't know to this day why he didn't attack me when I turned around and crouched down. But I gathered all the pieces and stood up, and now he was nowhere to be seen. Holding the pieces of my broken Discman and CD, I continued my march home, muttering some variation of, "Great, that's just great, perfect. What else is gonna happen today to make my day even shittier?" I would occasionally turn around and yell, "Fuck you, man," at the general direction of that guy. When I got home, I got straight into a fight with a furious mother for not calling her, and made sure not to mention what happened out of fear it would give credence to her side. The gravity of it all hit me in the shower, though, after all the adrenaline had subsided. I think I still cried more for my broken Discman, though, than for realizing the danger I had put myself through and what I'd just luckily survived. It all came crashing down on me 2 days later, when one of my neighbors was found stabbed in the lot behind the hedge where I was attacked. I didn't know her that well. We went to Sunday school together, but my family and hers were neighbors for years. I overheard my mother talking on the phone, though, about this serial killer that was making his rounds around the most affluent parts of the city, and how this was just the latest in his series of muggings and stabbings in the area. This happened in fall of 2017. My sister Gigi was in high school. My parents had taken a trip out of country, so I was in charge of my sister. I temporarily lived in my parents' house while doing so. I took her to school and back, picked her up when she was at her friend's or boyfriend's house, and picked her up after her church meetings as well. I was told she had recently started going to regular church on Sundays with her boyfriend and his family. which I was perfectly happy she was into. We grew up Catholic, but didn't often go to church after we moved to the USA. Also, she was going to another church at nights with a friend of hers. I grew up with Sunday Mass and that was it, so the thought of spending extra and free time going back to church was weird. But if she wanted to grow up as an extra religious person, who was I to stop her? Monday, she went to school and hung out with her boyfriend. I picked her up from her boyfriend's house. No big deal. Tuesday, she went to night church after school with her friend. I was told she would get a ride home from her friend's mom. She was supposed to be home at 9 p.m., but came in a little bit late at around 9:40. I asked why. She said they were preparing for a big retreat that Saturday. Seemed like an alright enough excuse, so I trusted her. No big deal, right? Wednesday and Thursday, mostly normal. One day she went home after school and we hung out. Another day she was hanging out with friends. One of these days she was hanging out with her boyfriend and some of his friends, and she asked me if she could go to church. This would be the second time going to the night church in the week. I remember thinking that when I was in high school, hanging out with friends did not cross with spending free time at church. They ended up not going, which actually relieved me a bit. I was starting to get some weird vibes from this night church. Friday, the day before their retreat, her plans were to go to night church after school and come home at 9 p.m. My plans were to hang out with friends and be home by 9 too. I was driving back home a little bit late and texted her to not worry her. I got no reply though. I waited a bit and texted her again. No reply. I called her. No answer. At this point, I was hoping she was already home and for some reason had gone to bed early. But no, the house was empty. I kept calling, texting, and then I started panicking. Around 10:45, almost 2 hours after she was supposed to be back, she finally called me. She said they were still preparing for the church retreat, and she wasn't allowed to have a cell phone on. I'm normally the cool older brother, but at this point I lost it a bit, and not towards her. I got to the point. I'm coming to get you. Text me the address right now. I don't care what you're doing, I'm coming. I got a text with the address and drove to get her. I was a bit calm now that I'd heard her voice, but instead I was pissed at the place now. Once I got there, some random lady was outside waiting for me. "Oh, hey there, sorry for the trouble, we're preparing for tomorrow and that's why Gigi is still here." That's fine, but I'm in charge of her for the week and our parents wanted her home by 9 every day, so get her right now, please. Well, Gigi can't come out right now. The sermon isn't over yet. At this point, I lost whatever patience I had left. You bring Gigi out right now or I'm calling the cops for kidnapping. I'm her legal guardian, and she's under 18. I don't know the law that well, but I just said that in the moment. That sparked a fire under her feet. The lady started walking inside quickly and invited me in as well. Do you want to come in maybe? You're welcome to. Just go get my sister right now. The lady walked inside and a moment later my sister came out with her. The lady was giving my sister some documents and a shirt with some information about tomorrow's retreat. In the car ride home, I was trying to choose my words carefully when my sister turned to me and said, "I don't think I want to go to that retreat tomorrow. Can I stay home and say you won't let me?" Yes, turn me into the bad guy. I don't care. Don't do anything you don't want to. It turns out everything up until tonight had been normal church stuff. Tonight, though, they turned it up to 11. People all around were seizing out, yelling, throwing up. They were feeding people something which was causing this, and the smoke and air smelled funny according to my sis. I kept asking her if they'd fed her something too, but she said no. They weren't supposed to until she went on her first retreat. The retreat, which the night church said they paid for her, making it seem like they were generous, was supposed to be an initiation or commitment to the place. According to my sister's friend who already went to the initiation, they give you something that makes you very sick, representing the evils leaving you, and you get ill for a week or two. The people there tonight were scary, and they didn't look right in the head. I read the stuff they gave to my sister as well. All culty stuff and BS. The place looked like a house that was made to look like a small church too. I later found out from my aunt that their church name didn't make sense either, from a Catholic point of view. They weren't listed or official. So, to this weird religious place that tried to poison my sister, I hope we don't meet again. This was a couple years ago, when I had just moved back to the city I grew up in. I was separated from my husband at the time and about to start the divorce process, so I was still getting used to this whole single mom thing. I had to go to Walmart one day, and had no choice but to take my 5-year-old and 1-year-old daughters along. I was pretty distracted dealing with my 5-year-old, who at the time loved running too far away from me in the store. Thankfully though, this is not a story where she was snatched up. I had noticed though while following her around, a man in the same aisles as us for a while. I brushed it off as a coincidence at first. We went to the candy aisle and I was looking at something on the shelf when I turned around to see the man was right behind me. His face must have been in my hair. I still wanted to believe the best though. I said I was sorry and assumed I was in his way. I noticed someone with a walkie-talkie come over and tell him to come with him. I was still being naive though, and assumed he must have been caught stealing or something. I paid for my items and went to leave, when I was stopped by loss prevention/security and asked to come with them. Of course, this was both scary and embarrassing. I knew I hadn't stolen anything, so I assumed my kids must have pocketed something while I wasn't looking. The person who pulled me into the room said though, "Don't worry, you're not in any trouble, but I really think you need to know what was going on. Did you notice a man following you while you were out there?" "Yeah, I saw someone near us, but I assumed it was a coincidence." They asked to make sure I didn't know this man, and this wasn't some sort of weird public fetish thing or something. They informed me that the man had been following me and my kids around masturbating. They didn't know if he was following me or if he was interested in my girls instead. I was horrified. They informed me the man had been banned from the store, and they walked me to my car to make sure we left safely. I don't know why they didn't call the police, and in hindsight I know I should have. I was just so freaked out and wanted to get me and my kids home safely. I met a guy this weekend. We were at the same restaurant and he was with a wedding party. I was with family, not connected to the wedding or couple in any way. We just happened to be at the same restaurant where the wedding reception was being hosted. He was very polite and respectful and offered me his number as well. I took it and decided to text him. We texted for a day or so and then made arrangements to get together for coffee. We got together in the middle of the day at a public place, and I drove myself as well. I texted a friend and told her where I'd be and the guy's name too. I figured I was just being overly cautious. The first 3/4 of the conversation were normal enough. We talked about work, schooling, basketball. It turned out he was a lot younger than I thought he was. He's 22 and I'm 35. He went from being kind of shy and very respectful to telling me a story about how the night after the wedding he came home and people were being crazy. I asked what he meant, and then he elaborated to tell me he had walked into his bedroom and lesbian girls he knew were having sex on his bed. He was a gentleman though and didn't stick around to watch. Then he locked eyes with me and asked, "Have you ever been in that kind of situation before?" "Well, I've lived in apartments, so I've heard some things sometimes." He pushed even further, though, and asked, "No, have you ever walked in on something like that?" "No, I haven't, and that's a weird story to tell someone you literally just met." I tried to change the subject. He talked about himself quite a lot. He did ask me questions, but would interrupt me when I tried to answer, and continued to talk about himself instead. I could tell something was odd. He was not acting like he had the night I met him. He leaned over the table a lot and made noticeable effort to lock eyes with me. I mean, I like eye contact, but it felt more like a stare-down interrogation after a while. I could feel myself moving further away the further he leaned in. He started to talk about how he used to pick up girls, but he didn't do that anymore because he realized the girls he picked up at bars were probably whores who went there every weekend. Then he wanted to know if I drank, smoked, did drugs, did I ever party, where did I party, where I like to go out to, did I ever see other men. Almost no pauses, just a barrage of questions one after the other. We talked for only a few minutes more. He looked at his phone and said, "The game I wanted to watch is going to start soon. Did you maybe want to get out of here?" Turns out there was a basketball game on or something, and he wanted me to go back to his place to watch it. No thanks. We just met, and I was not comfortable with doing that. Maybe we could talk again soon, though. His face sort of changed when I said that. "I'm sorry, but I really thought you were going to come back with me." I told him I wasn't sure how he got that impression. I had not said at any point I would do that. He kept begging me to come back to his place. I kept saying no. He kept asking me why not. I kept saying that I just met him. Fine, let's go to the park then. Red flags and alarm bells were going off now, so I said, no thanks, I was no longer interested. He basically begged and said we could even skip the game if I wanted him to. Just go home, we just met for coffee. It's not a big deal if we can't take it further today. He then asked me to walk alone in the field with him behind the coffee shop. He looked at the ground and said, "I'll literally do anything you want. Just come with me." I again said I wasn't going to do anything else with him that day. We'd talk later. I got into my car, and as he was pulling away, he yelled out one more time to convince me to come with him. I sat and watched him leave, though. Things just felt weird about this. I drove home, my phone blowing up the whole time. He was non-stop texting and calling, saying he was home and I should now come over. He even sent me a video of him watching basketball on his couch alone. He started sending me messages saying he could see a future with me, that I was the most beautiful woman he had ever met. It was horrible for a beautiful woman like me to be single. This entire date, mind you, was 40 minutes max. I told him I was not going to go back on what I said and stop responding. And then the calls really started. 7:55. 8 o'clock, 8:02, 8:03, 8:07. He called and called over and over for the next several hours. I texted him after the first couple saying to leave me alone. He then sent another text about how beautiful and perfect I was and how he wanted to date and travel together. All I could think at this point was, "I'm sorry, I don't feel the same way about you. I wish you well. Take care." He said he didn't understand. Did that mean I didn't want to see him again? I replied very straightforwardly this time. "Look, I'm sorry about not being clearer, but I don't want to see you again. I'm sorry. Goodbye." The calls and texts kept coming though. I even told him once more to please stop. I had to turn off my phone because he was doing it so much. They were all, "What did I do wrong? Why don't you tell me? I'll fix it. We can make this work between us. You owe this to me." I blocked his number, but my phone still logged call attempts from the blocked numbers. I could see he was calling almost every minute up until 2 a.m. He called a few more times this morning, and again this afternoon. I called my phone company to check, and turns out he sent me over 200 text messages as well in that one day. That was the tipping point. I decided to go to the police station and at least talk to them and possibly report it as suspicious behavior or harassment. All I had was his first name, and a phone number as well. Thankfully, the cops were really nice and took down all the info. Sure, he had never threatened me, but I had told him to stop and he refused. They said that was enough to be concerned. I showed them the texts, the timing of his calls. They said it all looked definitely obsessive and like unstable behavior. It was good that I came in, even just to put it on record in case things got worse. I felt real bad for even going there. Like it was stupid to have even gone to meet him, but I've been on lots of coffee dates and no one has ever done this kind of thing before. After I left the station, I went home and checked my phone. I had 3 voicemails from unknown numbers. It was all him, pleading for me to call him and tell him how to make this right. He just wouldn't understand why I blocked him. Now I was low-key terrified of what would happen next. Would the cops call him? If they did, would that make him mad? I was pretty sure I didn't tell him anything about what area of the city I lived in or where I worked. All he had at this point was my phone number. I considered changing my cell number, but I'm also hoping he'll get the point after a few days of silence and give up. I'm so shocked, I don't even know what to do next. Update: May 22nd, 2018. He's been texting and calling me from random numbers all day. I've been taking screenshots and sending them into the police with my report number. It's been a long, exhausting day. I really want to change my number, but he keeps sending me stuff. I feel it might be helpful to the police to figure out who he actually is. I've informed my family, friends, employer, cell phone provider, and building caretaker about this crazy pants, and given everyone a healthy description as well. I went out and bought 100 plus decibel alarms for the windows and doors in my apartment, and installed them all as well. Mega update. Today he wrote me a really long-winded message asking for another chance and begging forgiveness. He was overly excited to meet such a beautiful and well-endowed woman. He just needed one more chance to show me his true worth, pleading and begging for me to reply and meet him, and even signed his name at the bottom. I went on Facebook and found his profile. He has 0 security settings. He's not friends with a single person I know. I copied that link and sent it off to the cops. I'm torn between really hoping they can talk some sense into him and being terrified that if the police confront him, he'll just become even crazier. I would have slept a lot easier if I changed my number right away, but I might have never got his real name and profile if I had. I doubt the cops will do much until he starts threatening me. Now I'm torn though. Do I change it and sleep better at night, or let him keep screaming into the void while I collect all this evidence? I keep thinking all he has is my number. Update: March 17th, 2020. So, I haven't looked at this account since my last update, and now that most of the world is under quarantine, it occurred to me to sign in and take a look. First of all, many thanks to everyone who reached out to see if I'm okay. I totally am. At the time, I was terribly freaked out and just wanted not to think about this whole thing anymore. I hope no one worried too much. I'm sincerely sorry if you did. I made that initial post because I was so overwhelmed, and it was all just really difficult to work through. Things are 100% better now, though. I had a few weeks of silence after the last update, and then I got 2 or 3 calls from an odd number, a landline that I could do a reverse 411 lookup on. The address was from around the area of the coffee shop where we'd met. I recalled he had told me he lived a couple blocks over while he was trying to get me to come back to his basement. I sent the screenshot of the calls and the address to the police email I had been given, and made the choice to finally change my phone number as well. It was a giant pain in the ass, but I absolutely slept better after. I've been back to the restaurant twice and haven't seen him there, and I'm never in the area where we met for coffee either. It still makes me nervous when I see someone who looks like him, but I try to remind myself that the way he acted means he would latch on with a death grip to anyone who gave him the time of day. He's likely set his sights elsewhere by now. That's kind of terrifying in its own way, though. I hope he figures his shit out, and that other women he encounters get treated a lot better than I did. This was a long time ago, so the timeline might be a little bit off and some details might be slightly fuzzy, but I've written it out as exactly as I can recall it. In the early thousands, my family was living in Europe, and in December of 2001, we were coming back home to Latin America for Christmas vacation. My brother and I, both in high school at the time, and my dad were flying together from Paris to Miami. My dad was seated in business class, while my brother and I were in coach, sitting in the middle 2 seats of the middle row. The flight was pretty normal at first. Absolutely nothing out of the ordinary. About 4 or 5 hours into the flight, I was reading a book, almost dozing off, when I heard a woman start to repeat the word no over and over. At first, it was really quiet, almost inaudible, but very quickly it got loud and urgent. Before I realized what was even happening, she was screaming no at the top of her lungs. I looked up and saw a flight attendant a few rows ahead of me to the right, hunched over someone sitting in the window seat. My first thought was that the passenger must be having a heart attack or some catastrophic health problem. But her yelling was so unsettling that this couldn't possibly be it. There was a strangely long delay in people's reactions as well. Nobody did anything. I completely panicked and froze in my seat. My brother, on the other hand, jumped out of his and jumped over the person sitting on the aisle seat to his right. He ran up to see what was going on. He was up there in a matter of seconds, and as he approached, suddenly everyone around us stood up to see what was going on, or tried to help. She was screaming, and now struggling with this passenger. He was really tall, so tall that his whole head was visible over the back of the seat. He had long, curly black hair as well. My brother came back to our row and said, "Something is wrong," before going back to get a closer look. Passengers close to her began struggling with the man as well. A bunch of people jumped on him and started pulling at him. Someone in the row behind him even pulled his hair back so hard his face jerked toward the top of the plane. He let out a loud moan scream, and then there was chaos. The aisles were so crowded nobody could move. I saw a fire extinguisher being passed hand to hand from the back of the plane. At first, I thought there was a fire, and we were all going to die. It was an incredibly hopeless sensation to know there's nowhere to run, and no way to escape this situation unfolding in front of you. They passed the extinguisher up to the male flight attendant near the guy. The attendant smashed him with the butt of the extinguisher really hard on the face. They started asking for belts, headphones, straps, anything they could use to restrain him. My brother took off his belt and gave it to them. They wrapped everything they could around the passenger's arms, shoulders, and torso, securing him to the seat. I saw the attendant who had smacked him with the extinguisher carry a pair of large black tennis shoes to the back of the plane, which at the time seemed kind of strange, but I didn't really think much about it. The flight attendants asked if there was a doctor on board to sedate the man. People kept asking if there was a flight marshal on board as well, but nobody came forward. I can't remember exactly how or when things calmed down, but eventually everyone was told to return to their seats. A small group of people that helped restrain the guy were asked to keep guard on a rotation. There were always at least a few people sitting behind him or next to him. I think there was even someone behind him gripping a fistful of his hair for the rest of the flight. The pilot announced over the PA that there had been a security breach and that we were being diverted to Boston Logan Airport. He said they didn't know if the person was working alone, so get to know your neighbor. We were in the middle of the Atlantic, with maybe 4 more hours to go before we could land. Things were a bit ominous and tense, but for the most part everyone was friendly and in a pretty good mood. Nobody knew what had actually happened. We weren't allowed to get up from our seats, and if you had to use the bathroom, you needed to call a flight attendant to escort you to the lavatory, where you weren't allowed to lock the door. I remember a grumpy old Frenchman a few rows ahead of us got really annoyed after a while, and kept getting up without permission just to annoy the attendants. They were not happy. After a while, they put on the movie Legally Blonde to distract passengers. My brother and I went up to business class to talk to my dad. Apparently, none of them had heard the extent of the chaos back in coach. They were all going about business as usual. A few hours later, as we approached the U.S., we saw fighter jets outside the windows on both sides of the plane. The pilot announced they were escorting us to Boston. A few little kids got really excited watching the jets. I later learned that these are a last resort security measure to prevent hijacked planes from repeating 9/11-style attacks. They were supposed to shoot us down in case of a major threat. We landed and were told to stay seated. A SWAT team came on board carrying assault rifles and tons of body armor. They cut off the man's restraints and took him off the plane. I saw everything in great detail, since we were seated only a few seats behind him. We were parked in the middle of the tarmac for a long time before we were allowed to disembark. I remember seeing pieces of my brother's belt on the guy's seat as we left, and thought about taking one as a souvenir. I thought better of it in the end, though. We were escorted to a baggage claim area in Boston Logan that was surrounded by a large metal fence to keep us all in one place. We were there for what felt like 3 or 4 hours, just waiting anxiously, while no one would explain anything to us. The passengers were getting really agitated, shaking the metal fences and yelling at airport personnel that this was inhumane treatment. There was no food, nowhere to sit, and children were crying as well. Dozens of people were trying to sleep on the baggage carousel. They finally ordered a bunch of pizzas and led us into a waiting area with actual chairs, where each passenger was interrogated by the FBI. They were astonishingly unfriendly. I guess they were trying to discern if the guy had any partners on board. They then shuttled us to our baggage, where security officers thoroughly hand-searched every single passenger's shoes, suitcases, and carry-on bags, then patted everyone down. We were finally allowed to make a phone call, and I called my mom. The rest of the family were completely hysterical. They had been watching the news all day. Apparently, an Islamic extremist terrorist had tried to blow up our flight with a bomb he had smuggled on board in his shoe. We had absolutely no idea that had happened until this moment, as we were completely in the dark. It was a very strange sensation. Up until this point, my dad, brother, and I had actually remained pretty relaxed considering the circumstances. We were more annoyed about the inconvenient changes to our travel itinerary than the crazy experience on the plane. We had no idea how bad this security breach really was, and how close we all came to being killed. After about 12 hours in Boston, we were put on another flight home. My brother made the mistake of giving a few interviews to CNN and other networks while we were in Boston, so when we landed in our small country, he was immediately swarmed by the press and gave a bunch of interviews despite being exhausted. I was happy, though, to finally sit and relax with my family after the longest and most stressful trip of my life. We later learned the bomber Richard Reed had actually tried to board the same flight on the previous day. He was detained and questioned by French security because of multiple red flags, causing him to miss his flight. They put him on the next days and put him up in a hotel kind of far from the airport, since everything nearby was booked. The following day it had rained, and on the walk from the hotel to the airport, his shoes got really wet. This must have been why he had trouble lighting the wick in his shoe. His plan was to light it mid-flight. He waited until the passenger next to him went to the bathroom, then tried to light his shoe with matches. The female flight attendant that first engaged him had smelled them, and was walking up and down the aisle looking for a passenger who she assumed was trying to smoke a cigarette. When she saw him with the shoe in his lap, she immediately tried to take it from him. They struggled a bit, and he bit her hand. Reed is now serving 3 life terms in prison. So I live in the valley of Sacramento, California, a few miles from the American River. This particular river is only a short walk from a vintage part of my town, where absolutely nothing but chickens and family-owned businesses are. My first job was at a family-owned coffee shop when I was around 16 in that little town. To give you some backstory. Now, a lot of homeless folk often flocked to the river and would often wander into my shop as well. I dealt with the odd bodies on and off almost every day without care. However, there was one weirdo I remember vividly enough that it still makes me sit and wonder. When I was new to the shop, it took some time to get to know the regulars and remember their names. I had a lot of faces to memorize after all. One face in particular, for some reason, sat in my mind far above others. A stout, bald man with a wide nose. He wasn't quite old, but he also was not the youngest man I'd ever met. He would just stand outside of the store for about 10 minutes every day, before coming in to stand at the back and watch me and my other coworkers clean and make coffee. Sometimes he wouldn't even order everything. When he did, though, he would always get a small black coffee with a small serving of potato salad. He would always ask for napkins and would always ask for a pen as well. After ordering, he would proceed to write things down on one of these napkins, leave his empty coffee cup on a table, and take his food out the door, where he would stand and watch us pick up his trash. I noticed over time he seemed to look very irritated whenever I wasn't the one to do so. Every time he did this, he would leave small notes in poor and rough handwriting. He would then throw away his salad outside. At first, I thought of it as nothing more than a sweet thank you. I often write small notes to servers on receipts from time to time. Things like, "Have a wonderful day, thank you." But it slowly became stranger over time. "Beautiful day, take a break, I'm outside. You look so lovely today, I love your hair." My coworkers started to make a gag out of the notes if they weren't thrown away before reading. Once, I assume he figured out that the other girls were the ones grabbing them. He began to leave them on the end of the counter where my espresso machine was. "You make me happy, Kiane," one of them read. I don't know how he even learned my name or who he asked for it, but I presume it was one of my coworkers on a day I was off. I began to get increasingly uncomfortable whenever he would just stand outside and watch me work, or when he would order from my till. I could only smile and thank him as I got his coffee and salad though, customer service voice and all. The next part is where it really gets interesting. One week, toward the end of summer, he worked his routine of window shopping before ordering, asking for napkins and a pen, and going about his little letter. This day, however, he didn't ask for a pen or napkins. He proceeded to only ask for coffee. He left to the restroom. I forgot how long he was in there, since I took myself to lunch break as soon as the order was done. When I returned, I was told that someone had left their cup in the restroom, and it had been emptied and left on top of the toilet. It was filled with semen. I don't know if it was him, but the timing was way too close to not assume. I didn't see him after that for a while, because I traded my early starts for closing shifts. The last time I had seen him, he came in late. I presume he found this out either by stalking or asking my coworkers why I was no longer a morning maid. He asked me kindly for a cup of coffee, a potato salad, a pen, and a napkin. I obliged, but I was hardly enthusiastic. The routine went as normal. He drank his coffee, sat and wrote, left it on the counter without looking up, and walked out into the night. He didn't even stop to watch. He didn't throw away his salad either. "You're lovely every time. Thank you for the smiles. Leave the glitter to the blondes. You're a young flower amongst the sunset after all." After that, I never saw him come into the store or lurk outside the window again. I don't often lend out pens as much as I used to either. This story is from 2019. I was 13 years old at the time, but I still remember it like it was just yesterday. Perhaps due to the trauma, maybe. I was bored at home alone. I FaceTimed my best friend, who lives in the apartment building next to mine. I asked him if he wanted to join me in a walk around the neighborhood. It turned out he wasn't there though. He was on his way back home from school, which was understandable because it was a Thursday afternoon. There was a jogging circuit near my house around 500 meters away. Due to my massive boredom, I put on my sports clothes, a basic t-shirt and shorts, and headed out with my music, vibing along to the circuit. These shorts had no pockets. Remember this detail. Arriving there, it was surprisingly not all that empty actually. There were around 8 to 10 people in that 15-kilometer circuit. I started walking for a bit, and then ran for a couple of kilometers, then laid down on the grass. I noticed 2 guys on a motorcycle going back and forth. I didn't care that much though, since I was FaceTiming my 2 best friends while lying down. It had started to get pretty late after a while, around 6 p.m., and I was exhausted. I started to walk home, but I took another path that was kind of a shortcut. I had to walk through this empty, huge street with buildings still under construction. I had taken that path before many times though with no problems. Suddenly, after walking for a while, I began to have this feeling that someone was watching me or perhaps following me. I turned around and noticed those same 2 guys on that motorcycle heading toward me. I whispered to my friends on FaceTime that something weird was going to happen. They would have to cut their mics and focus on me. The guys drove right next to me, and one of them asked me where the nearest barber shop was. Out of stress, I gave them a random location. While the rider of the bike asked me about the shop, my right eye twitched and unfocused. I sort of have an involuntary tic. I was still able to see with it though as it did this. I saw in the bike's rearview mirror that the other guy was trying to look at where my phone was located. It was between my shorts and my belly because I had no pockets. I was freaking out. Time was starting to slow down. Seconds felt like hours, and I couldn't feel my legs anymore. They went on with a slow speed, like they were planning a backup plan. I had 3 options, it seemed. There was a taxi guy fixing his car. Maybe I could go to him and explain the situation. But my gut said, what if they noticed me and came back, and did whatever they planned to do anyway? 2, I could try to stop a random car and explain the situation. My gut said no, though. What if the car was still locked and the guys would have noticed either way? And 3, which is what I chose, to run in the opposite direction into traffic and take the path I had just come by. I instinctively ran for a straight 5 minutes. Finally, I couldn't do it anymore, though. I entered a field and started running towards some slums. I looked back and saw the guys chasing after me into the field. One of them was shouting how they still just wanted directions. There's one good thing about me though, and it's that I always trust my gut, and it told me run as fast as you can or you will die today. That's what I did. I ran between the slums and kept running until I arrived near my best friend's house, who I was still on FaceTime with. I told him to come downstairs right now, and laid down in the parking lot. He came in and was freaked out because he knew something was going down, but didn't know what since I didn't give him much information. My face turned yellow, and I threw up. I couldn't feel my arms or legs anymore. He walked me up, and I laid down, and from that moment I don't really remember anything else. I just remember waking up the following day with bruises on my leg due to me running into the field full of pikes.